Loading now. All right, there we are. All right, let me share this real quick to my socials, and then we'll
Cool.
be good. Yeah, people are gonna have to use my PayPal now for super
Damn.
chats.
It's all good. Yeah, it's fucked. I had a feeling, man. I was thinking about monetizing and stuff, but I think monetizing through YouTube is like a dead zone now because censorship is ramping up and
Oh, that's right. I'm now realizing that when I watch your videos, I don't get
mhm.
any ads.
Yeah, no, we don't monetize it at all because I've been saying for a minute, I was like, that's how they control you. Like once we just purely use YouTube for like posting, you know what I mean? Like we don't use it to get money because once money is involved, then that's how they try to screw you over.
Yeah, that's how they. I did not have a
Think
problem with
for a
YouTube
minute,
at
I was
all
like, that's how they control you.
promoting
Like
on the side.
once we just purely use
Yeah, I wasn't getting any problems with YouTube at all before I was monetized. It was after I got monetized I started getting problems.
think
And I
for a
guess
minute, I was
people were
like, that's
also
how they
mass
control you.
reporting
Like
my
once
videos or something.
wow.
Because there's all these trolls now because of like the force to vote and all the people who were against it.
Yeah,
I'm just
right.
I'm just speculating here that maybe there was a lot of them that were like mass reporting me and like Combo Couch and other people.
That's how it is. That's how they do it.
It's insane, man.
They
But
use
yeah,
bots.
I'll give you a formal intro in just a sec.
Cool.
Yeah.
Where are you based in right now?
I'm in the DC, Maryland area. It's
Oh,
DC,
okay,
Maryland,
cool.
Virginia area.
That's what's up. That's what's up.
Yeah.
I'm in LA. I'm from New York, born and raised, but I live in LA.
Yeah, yeah, I heard you mention that in your videos. Um,
Cool.
so we got your friend, the Falcone General, right here. He just tuned in. What's
Cool.
up, man? Oh, dang. Well, it always gets laggy when I'm trying to share things, so we'll just get started. All right, welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. I am your host, Franco. I am joined today by a comrade, Ramiro of Anticonquista, an anti imperialist media collective by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And you guys also have on guests that are from all other parts of the world, like Asia and Africa. So thank you very much for being here, comrade. How are you?
I'm doing all right, man. I'm good. Just here chilling. I'm sad to hear about your demonetization and the crackdowns on the left. As we can anticipate, the Biden administration is going to continue cracking down on independent voices. But solidarity with you, man. I know it's rough.
Yeah, if anything, this will unite us more, though. But we're gonna keep collaborating with people as much as possible and try to find alternatives, and try to hype each other's channels up. Because we can't let the predator class defeat us. So yeah. So you're Honduran, right?
Yeah, my family's from Honduras. I was born and raised in New York, but my family's from Honduras. I was born in 1991, and I've visited Honduras several times. And actually, it was because of the 2009 coup, U.S.-backed coup against Manuel Zelaya, that I began to move towards socialism. I went from kind of a liberal to a social democrat to now being a Marxist-Leninist, and it was a political transition that was aided by my visits to Honduras.
Yeah, damn. Yeah, I'm Peruvian. My parents left Peru in the 90s. They left there for they went to college, they studied biology, and then they came to the DC area. That's where I was born. I was influenced by them to be a biologist, but then I chose this track. I felt like I was missing out by not informing myself more, and then that motivated me to inform more people, and that's why I'm here now.
What's
So
up?
yeah, I found you guys recently, just a few months ago, thanks to people in my Discord, and I am amazed by the work that you guys do. It's a very educational channel for people to understand the history and understand history and socialism. You just had on Immortal Technique last week. And that was amazing. So I wanted to congratulate you guys on the hard work that you all do at Anticonquista to educate us.
Well, Steph, man, thank you. We really appreciate it. And we even have a good convo mentioning Peru with Comrade Kayla, who we had a conversation about the history of Peruvian socialism. We go into everything from Mariátegui to the Sendero Luminoso to the Tupac Amaru Liberation Front
Mm.
and Peruvian resistance today. So if you get a chance, you should check that out. And you can find us youtube.com/Anticonquista.
For sure, man. I saw the one that you had about the history of Peru. I can't remember the young lady's name that you had on it, but that was really good. I definitely have to educate myself more on the history of Peru. I had my cousin on recently to talk about some recent shenanigans that happened in Peru where they had 2 presidents in a week or 3 presidents in a week because of the corruption there. But I need to understand more about Latin American history in general. So what motivated you to start Anticonquista? What is the origin story of this media collective?
Well, it's definitely, man. So basically, Anticonquista goes back to around 2016. That was the year I moved to LA. I'm born and raised in New York, but I moved to LA around 2015, 2016, and I had started coming up with the idea for it. Came out with the domain around that time period. There was a lot of attention and focus on Antifa, which is called anti-fascist, right? Antifa. And I was excited by it, and I was glad that they were promoting leftism, socialism, anarchism. But I felt that there was something missing, and that so much attention was being focused on fascism and not enough attention being placed on imperialism. And imperialism is the current stage of economics, of politics, that we're now the highest stage of capitalism, as Vladimir Lenin talked about. And another aspect that I really came to mind was the fact that there were so many different Latin American leftist groups that were doing a lot of the same work, but were working very disunited. For example, I was involved in a lot of the Honduran solidarity movement stuff against the coup d'etat. I knew a lot of Puerto Ricans campaigning for independence. I knew a lot of Latin Americans in general. But there was no real online space for Latinos in the diaspora to come together as socialists, as anti-imperialists, to collaborate along the lines of anti-imperialism, which in my mind, imperialism is the biggest enemy of humanity. It's a destructive system that's not just impacting Latin America and the Caribbean, but the world as a whole. And so around that time period, me and Ofelia Carrillo, who's also a co-editor of Anticonquista, also my girlfriend, we started developing the idea more. Eventually, we moved to Ecuador in 2017, and we started working for Telesur English, which is where we were working. I was an editor there. She was a social media writer. We met a good comrade named Carlos, who's from Colombia, lives in the UK, and we started talking about this idea that we had about Anticonquista and representing Latin American socialism from our perspective in the diaspora, not just being told by white liberals who dominated the space. And so we started talking more, and we're like, let's do this, let's build this. And so we kept building it, We launched on Indigenous Peoples Day, October 12th, 2017. Also the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, incorporating both of our identities as Marxism, Leninism, and indigenous socialism. And we kept building and growing Anticonquista. Another comrade came through, Nick Ayala, shout out to Nick, who is also co-editor. He's from Newark, New Jersey, but he was living out here in Cali for a little bit. Also another comrade, Rich Piedradita in West Virginia, who got involved as well. Shout out to Rich. And so little by little, we started growing, we started building, working together, creating articles, videos. And a big part of what we wanted to do is not just create media, not just do theory, but also practice. We want to give back to people in our motherland. And so since we've started within the last 3 years, we've already donated thousands of dollars in solidarity with movements in countries all over the region, in Haiti, in Puerto Rico, Colombia, Chile, Honduras. And so we've combined the theory and practice of socialism through our media work. We're growing. Right now we just expanded our social media team to 7 other comrades. and we just keep growing and building. And that's really how we started. Is anti-conquista. We're against the conquest of our people from 1492 to the present. You know, whether that's Spanish conquistadores, whether that's the U.S. imperialists. We are 100% against that. And that's what we've been doing.
That's what's up, man. Yeah, you guys are doing amazing work. So I want to educate my audience more about what exactly communism is. I have a lot of there's a lot of people who understand what it is, but I still want to educate the people that don't know. So can you tell us more about what communism is for the viewers who don't know, and how is communism different from socialism?
Yeah, that's good that you mentioned that because I think these are terms we hear a lot. And myself as a communist, I sometimes like being around other communists, we forget to really go back to basics and explain what these things are. So, socialism and communism are a bit different. So, socialism is a stage toward communism. So, let me just back up a little bit. Part of the central thesis of Marxism is this concept of historical materialism, basically this idea that the history of humanity develops as a series of revolutions of different systems that replace one another. So, for example, humans, for the most of our existence as a human species, have lived in communal units in what we call primitive communism. Not primitive because we view the people as inferior or primitive, but because it represents a microcosm of what communism represents. The way tribal society, there is no private property. People didn't demarcate their land, and they didn't have private ownership over materials. There was no one to be like, this river is mine, this tree is mine, this piece of land is mine. That didn't exist. After this era of what we call primitive communism or communalism, we have the rise of slave societies and feudalism, because you have the rise of private property. You know, eventually, once humans discover how to use tools and how to begin conquering other areas, you have the rise of empires. You have the rise of the Roman Empire, the Macedonian Empire, the Greek. And then eventually, in the new era following that, we have the rise of feudalism after after the fall of the Roman Empire around the 400s. We have the rise of feudalism. Kings, queens, nobles dominate serfs. You know, they own pieces of land where serfs work as indentured servants and give a part of their agriculture to the king and queen and nobility for protection. And then from feudalism, once we have the conquest of the so-called New World, once the Americas were colonized, once Africa and South Asia was colonized by the Europeans, then you have the rise of capitalism, which is the system we're in today. Capitalism started around anywhere from the 1600s, 1700s to today to the present. And capitalism is marked by private property over the means of production. This means that people can buy things like water, like land. There is private property. Human beings can take ownership over something. And this is also marked by the exploitation of workers. You know, you have under capitalism the proletariat, which is the working class, and you have the bourgeoisie, which is the ruling class. The bourgeoisie are the people who own the means of production. The bourgeoisie own the banks, the institutions. They own Amazon. You know, the fact that Jeff Bezos is a perfect example of someone in the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, with the workers who send those supplies. Even though they produce that wealth that Amazon creates, they're not in control of that. And so part of Marxist theory and historical materialism is this understanding that capitalism is unstable. Like every other system that predates capitalism, like feudalism and slave society, it will eventually come to a crisis because the exploitation of labor will get so bad that the working class will take power away from the capitalists and begin to build socialism. And socialism is a transitory stage after capitalism, where we define it as the dictatorship of the proletariat. What does that mean? The dictatorship of the proletariat means that the workers become the new ruling class. They take over the state. And we saw examples of this in the Soviet Union. We saw examples of this in the People's Republic of China, in Cuba, in Vietnam, and several other countries during the 20th century, and even today. Socialism is a process. It takes hundreds of years to build. Socialism is something that is created and constructed, which is one of the reasons why in Bolivia, Evo Morales' party is called Movimiento al
Hmm.
Socialismo, the movement towards socialism. So it's not something that you can't say like, oh, this country is socialist or not. It's a spectrum that takes a long time to build and create. Communism is the stage after socialism, which we may not even see in our
Hmm.
lifetime, but it's something that we still fight for because it means the eradication of private property. It means abundance. It means that all of the resources that exist on the earth can be used to feed, house, clothe, educate, and medicate everyone on this planet. And it's something that will take a long time, but communism is basically the end goal of socialism. And so the main difference between people who call themselves socialists and people who call themselves communists is that people who call themselves socialists tend to be what we call more social democratic. People like Bernie Sanders, AOC, people who believe that you have to work within the capitalist system to make little reforms here and there to until we reach socialism and communism. That's called evolutionary socialism or social democracy, right? Or democratic
Mm.
socialism. Now, people who call themselves communists believe in revolution, that the only way to change the system to bring power to the working class is through revolution, whether that's violent or not violent, whether that's taking the state by force. The people who call themselves communists, like Fidel Castro, like Mao Zedong, like Lenin, they are communists. So that's more or less the difference between socialism and communism.
So you just define communism, you define socialism. Where does the term Marxism come into play?
So Marxism, Karl Marx was a German revolutionary from the 1800s. His family, interestingly enough, had really wealthy roots. He actually was related to some of the Rothschilds banking dynasty in Germany. He has origins in Germany, but he was a class trader in the sense that he spoke out against capitalism. He spoke out against the banks. He spoke out against imperialism, and he wrote several works. Some of them, like Capital, are more recognized, the Communist Manifesto. But he also wrote some other ones, like The Poverty of Philosophy, The German Ideology. And he was not only a writer, he was also an activist. He was very involved in the German revolutions of 1840s, what they call the Spring of Nations, which were overthrow revolutions against feudalism. So he was writing at the time in the 1800s when feudalism was coming to an end and capitalism was rising, right, around the 1800s. And by analyzing the decline of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, he's saying, look, capitalism is also eventually going to fall because of its own contradictions, and it'll be the working class that comes to rise. And Marx is the founder of the First International, which was one of the main organizations that eventually led to the formation of the Soviet Union. And he wasn't the first socialist. I will say that a lot
Hmm.
of people have this idea that he was like the founder of it. Socialism and anti-capitalism actually predates Karl Marx, but he was one of the people who was the first to provide what we call a scientific socialist outlook. Because prior to that, the two main critiques of capitalism were one from the Catholic Church, which officially still is anti-capitalist, but because it's in favor of feudalism, of serving, a religious-based order with nobility and serving God. The other was what we call idealist socialism or anarchist socialism or utopian socialism, which is not based on the actually existing conditions, but is just based on like, well, we want everyone should have like 10 cars and everyone, it's not scientific. And what Marx did is that he brought dialectics, which is a method of philosophy, and materialism, which is also a way of understanding the world, to socialism. And he created a scientific basis for which socialism could be built. And so that's really the legacy of Karl Marx.
Yeah, I've heard from several people who see the problems with our current neoliberal system and money in politics and think that the solution isn't to become communist nor to take a socialist route. They believe that the solution is to adopt a mixed economy model similar to that of the Nordic countries. But these people fail to realize that switching to a mixed economy won't entirely make the problem go away. The problem, which you just told us, is capitalism. We will still have capitalism. So why is communism better than a mixed economy of social democracy?
That's a great question. I have this conversation all the time with people, especially I would say boomers. Like I have this conversation with my dad all the time. He's more on the liberal social democratic side because we always hear this like everything in moderation, take
Yeah.
the good from both and combine it. Well, it doesn't work that way because capitalism is inherently at its core unstable. And this is what Marx talked about in Capital. You have the theory of overproduction, and inherent in every single dollar and every financial transaction in capitalism, there is the basis of exploitation, which is called surplus value, right? This is what Marx talks about in Capital. For example, let's say you have a sneaker factory, right? Like I'm born and raised in New York. Everyone loved Jordans, right? Everyone used to rock Jordans. I used to have rock Jordans as well. I'm not going to lie. A, a pair of
Same.
Jordans, you and I know, are like, they used to cost like $150, $200 sometimes, right?
Sometimes even
But
more.
sometimes even more, right? But if we look at that pair of Jordans, right, we're looking at it from the consumer end, right? We buy it, let's say $200. It may only cost $10 or $15 to buy the supplies, right? It may only, if they have their factory in somewhere like Haiti or in Peru or in our countries, maybe they'll pay $5 that hour for the worker to create that pair of shoes. Maybe, another within those pair of shoes, maybe another $50 for the rent for the factory that they're using to produce it. Shipping, add another, $20. And so if you do the math, there's a leftover amount that the capitalist or the owner, or Michael Jordan in this case, the capitalist, keeps. And that's called the surplus value. That's everything that's left over from the necessary expenses, the wages, the delivery costs, everything from beginning to end. And every time a pair of shoes is made, that surplus value keeps accumulating more, 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 more. And it creates a situation where the poor people who create those shoes or who buy those shoes are not even able to purchase them. And that capitalist gets richer and richer, and the working class gets poorer and poorer. So it's built in to the capitalist system, every transaction, that every single transaction under capitalism, the richer get richer, the poorer get poorer. I mean, look at right now under COVID-19, you have millions and millions of people who are losing their jobs. Some industries totally went out of sale. People who clean buildings, for example, like in New York, there's all these buildings where people used to work out of. And now that because of remote working, all the people who used to clean them, who have nothing to sell but their labor, they're no longer able to work, right? But those companies are making even more money because now they don't even have to pay the rent or the leasing on that property. And so we're seeing this happen today. Jeff Bezos became, I don't know, like a gajillionaire during this pandemic. And so we're seeing it happen and unfold before our eyes, where every year the capitalist class gets smaller, but also richer, and the working class gets poorer, but also bigger. And so that creates an unstable situation where eventually capitalism will collapse and will rip because of its own internal contradiction. And so that's what I tell people when they try to mix socialism and capitalism. They're like, oh, let's combine, let's mix the two, everything in moderation, yin yang. I'm like, it doesn't work like that because the foundations of it are at its core rotten. If you're buying a house, for example, and the person who you're buying it from tells you, hey, the walls have asbestos and there's termites and this shit could collapse anytime. And like people who are reformists, who are like social democrats, they're like, you know what, let's paint over these walls and make them look nice. And but it's like, hey, the walls are about to collapse soon. Like we have to address the root issue. If we don't tear down this house and build a new one with a solid foundation, then this house is going to collapse on us. And so that's my response to people who try to take the reformist route or try to combine both in a mixed economy, is that it doesn't work that way. We're going to have to get to a point where as Mark said, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. There's no reason why millionaires need 30 rooms in a mansion and need to use tons and tons of gallons of water for their pool while people are dying of thirst on the African continent. So we need to bring all of our resources as a global species, as a humanity, pull our resources together to make sure that everyone has what they need. And it's totally possible. There's enough food, there's enough climate, land for everyone to have what they need. But it's just the way it's organized and distributed under capitalism that it's irrationally planned, So that's the main issue.
Yeah, it's something people say who are for the mixed economy is that, oh, what we have isn't capitalism here in the States, it's corporatism, or they say that it's socialism for corporations. However, what I see is that corporatism will always result with capitalism. Another criticism I hear um, is that we won't be able to compete and be able to have small businesses unless they're approved by the people. Are these criticisms valid?
You know what? Those are really good questions and points. And I'm not going to lie, my position has changed a little bit on them. I think that starting off with the small business question, as a communist, I used to be against small businesses at first. And I said that because I believed, all business under capitalism is corrupt, this and that. However, seeing the 21st century, seeing the way that countries around the world that are trying to build socialism, like Bolivia, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, like Cuba, these countries, they're forced to compete into the global market. It's not a choice, right? So people act like, oh, like once you have a revolution and declare yourself socialist, you get a magic wand and you get to build your society the way you want to. It doesn't work like that. You're forced to compete in the global economy. You have to have businesses. You have to have a market sector. And we see that happening today, even in Vietnam and Cuba and Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And so I believe that under socialism, there is room for small family businesses like restaurants, like hotels. I think things like that should be run by small businesses and not monopolies, right? Under socialism. And under socialism, you can have a progressive government that actually gives zero interest or low interest loans to those businesses to build the economy. And that's been one of the debates within the left. I'm glad you mentioned that, because within the left, you have two kind of tendencies, right? And let's use China as an example. China, in the lead up to 1978, had a smaller business sector, right? Everything was government run. And at that time also, they had more economic hardship. It was harder to industrialize China. Eventually in 1978, with the reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping, eventually they allowed businesses to open, to grow. And because of that, China was able to industrialize, to build faster and compete against the West the way it is today. And Cuba was forced to do that as well in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia have also been doing that as well, have a small mom and pop business sector. But the main industries should be controlled by the state. Things like the trains, things like oil and gas, energy, things like supermarkets. Those things are, when we're talking about the basics of human survival, those are things that under socialism should definitely be under the control of the state and the people. Now, when you're talking about like designing clothes or little restaurants, I think there is definitely room for small businesses. And I think that the left has changed in that regard. And I think it's something that we in the US have to learn to adapt. Is like under socialism, yes, there can be small mom and pop businesses. Under communism, I think it would become irrelevant, because the concept of money, the concept of capital would cease to exist, because it wouldn't even be relevant, because there's enough abundance. People wouldn't even need to use currency to measure wealth and value, because there's so much material abundance created by socialism that the need for that withers away. That's part of the Marxist theory. In terms of the other question that you were asking about, human nature and, socialism, that there's this concept that, greed is human nature, right? We've
Mm-hmm.
heard it everywhere. Everyone says that,
Yeah.
like everyone I tell that to, like all my family is pretty right wing. I think I'm the only leftist socialist in my family, and everyone's like, "You do you, you do you." That's the motto of Western capitalism: focus on you. And it's not true. Everything in society is the result of collective nature, even under capitalism. That's the crazy part. Is like, for example, like this phone that I'm holding up right now, this iPhone, right? This phone is the result of a collective process. There was countless people. I don't even know their names. Someone in China or Philippines had to get the rubber to make the case. Someone in Africa had to get the materials, the minerals to make the chips. Someone in another country assembled it. Another worker in the U.S. put it in the box and sent it to the store. Another worker delivered it to me. So everything in human society is collective. Human beings are collective beings, and that's how we evolved. That's
Yeah.
how, as a human species, we evolved because of our collective nature. Everything that we see built around us, roads, buildings, are the result of collective human work. And that's why socialists use the five-pointed star, because the 5 points represent the five fingers of the hand that are able to create and construct and build. So the wealth
Mm.
of humanity is built on human labor, on the human hand. And once this human hand joins with other hands, like a hand with fingers, we create a fist and we become even stronger. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind, is that everything we see around us is not the result of individuals. Even for example, somebody like Trump, right, who's like, yeah, I'm a self-made man, I made all this money. I'm like, you didn't build that building. I didn't see
Mm-hmm.
you out there building every single stuff. People did that. And so that's the biggest illusion, that, individualism, that individual people can create all the wealth they have. Nope, not at all. This is all collective, and this is all the result of humans working together. Now, the question is, regardless of the system, people work together. The question is, who owns that wealth that we create? Is it going to be a small group of bankers and monopolists, or is it going to be the people who actually build it? And socialists will answer that with the latter, the fact that the working class of people who build it should own it. Like Emiliano Zapata from Mexico said, the people who work the land should own it.
That's something that people realize too when they raise their consciousness, is that we can't accomplish things by ourselves. So our greed, like, we'll become more conscious of our greed once we are educated more and realize the things that you were just telling us, right? So things are going, people think that our greed is going to overwhelm us, or it's going to overwhelm some individual, and then we're going to get capitalism again because we can't get rid of this greed. No, like, we will evolve like how we've been evolving for thousands of years. So yeah, you explained it really well. One thing I've heard from some of the guests on your show is that they were initially turned off by Marxism because they thought it was about a white guy and that it's racist. I also hear that some minorities who are very informed about what's happening in our world still do not agree with Marxism because they say he was racist. Others say that he was a psyop. Is it silly for people to not separate Marx, the person, from Marxism, and to call the entire theory racist?
Most definitely. I think it's very silly, very uneducated for people to claim, first of all, that Marx was racist, that he was horrible, and also to give him all of the attention. I fall somewhere in the middle, right? On the one hand, I definitely agree that a lot of Marx's ideas were based on indigenous peoples, the way indigenous peoples lived, communal living. A lot of his work is actually based on ethnographic studies of indigenous societies, indigenous people around the world. And socialism did not start with Karl Marx, for sure. That's something that's very true. And even he himself admits that, it's not like Marx was writing and saying, yo, I created this, like nobody else made, like he says that, like, this is based on my observations of other societies. That said, we have to give Marx the credit that he deserves. He basically systematized. He wrote about capitalism at a time when it was just rising. Again, mentioning that he was writing around the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. I think Capital, which is a 3-volume work, which is his main magnum opus, this was published around the late 1800s, 1870s, 1880s, closer toward when he died. Frederick Engels, his biggest collaborator, helped to publish that. And he was writing about a system that was just beginning to rise. He studied the intricacies of how it worked on economics. And this is something that I think that the left is totally failing on. I know I want to give a shout out to one of my comrades, Caleb, who you've had on as well, Caleb Maupin. He does a great job of exposing what he calls, and I think it's a great term, the synthetic left, which is this new postmodern left where everything's politically incorrect, everything is problematic, it's just like, no, like, we have to understand history in a scientific way. Marx was writing in the 1800s, based on what he was seeing. And his Marxism is fundamentally at its core economic based, right? Marxism is not just about vocabulary. It's not about just like theories about society and psychology. That's part of it, but that's secondary to the economics of capitalism. That's really what Marx wrote a lot about surplus value, exploitation, the falling rate of profit. All these things are central to Marxism. And so much of the synthetic left promotes this idea that Marx was racist, that he was all these horrible things. And how convenient that viewpoint is something that the imperialist and the CIA-backed think tanks also want to promote, to disconnect Black and brown people from Marxism, because that's been the goal, right? They don't want people in the global South to study Marxism and apply it, because guess what? In Cuba, they studied Marx, they applied it, and they did amazing things. In Angola, they studied Marx, they applied it, did amazing things as well. China, Soviet Union, etc. We've seen the success of Marxism around the world when it's applied to the local conditions. And so after World War II and the rise of the Cold War, that was part of the strategy of the U.S. imperialists, is to basically use identity politics against the left, to attack the left from the left, to make it seem, because before, what the U.S. imperialists would do is that they would say, oh, communism is radical, it's extreme, it's doing all these crazy things, and that had the reverse effect. It actually promoted socialism, because people were like, what are they talking about? It must be good if they're so scared of it, right? But now, after the Cold War, the strategy was different. They had a liberal imperialist strategy where they said, no, let's claim the Soviet Union as this rigid, conservative, they're closed-minded, you're brainwashed. And the West, we're just these like open-minded hippies and liberals, and we love, intersectionality and all this nonsense. And that's been the strategy that is still in place today. And so a lot of the people who promote that idea that Marx was, racist and reactionary, they're regurgitating that same imperialist propaganda that serves the interests of Wall Street, because they don't want, can you imagine, like, even the Panthers, the Black Panthers were militant Marxist-Leninists. They studied Marx. They weren't just like, oh, he's problematic, like, we're not, they studied him. They had classes on Marx, and they would apply that, and they were extremely successful as well, even though they were cracked down. And so I think, on the one hand, while I definitely have my critiques about Marx, I have certain disagreements as well. I highly admire him, because he was writing about a system and the collapse of a system hundreds of years before even today. And the way it's happening, the way we see capitalism collapsing now, we saw the whole Wall Street thing with GameStop. All that stuff is happening exactly the way he wrote about it in Capital. So I really recommend everybody actually read and study Marx before you just disregard him as some racist.
Yeah, that's something. Some people just dismiss it based off of what they heard other people say or people who they admire on independent media, and then they haven't even read the material. So in order for them to, if they really want to like debunk Marx, then they should study it. That's the best way you can debunk something, is if you fully understand it, right? And maybe they'll change their mind if they fully understand it. I'm glad that you brought up the synthetic left and Caleb Maupin. We were having a discussion about Forced to Vote and all these people on the synthetic left that were attacking people like Jimmy Dore, people like myself, and others who are on the ground fighting for forced to vote. So isn't that a socialist practice to do? Like, there's people on BreadTube who like Vosh and those people who claim to be socialists, who are trashing the forced to vote movement. Like, isn't it socialist to be for a movement like forced to vote, where you're pressuring politicians to do the things that they promise to do?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good point. I'm in solidarity with you, with Jimmy Dore, everybody who is pushing the force to vote. That's exactly what socialists should be doing. And a lot of these posers and imposters in BreadTube, or whatever the hell they call it, like, they are not really even Marxists and socialists. You hear the way they talk, they're just, puppets of, they're a perfect example of the synthetic left, because they use language and terminology, and they talk about certain topics that historically the left has spoken about, but they always redirect it back to the Democratic Party, and especially the neoliberal Biden faction. And so it's really sad to see that. But at the end of the day, like, they're not even real socialists or leftists, because they're just stooging for the same party that is gonna not care about the working class. They're not trying to hold Biden and his administration under any fire whatsoever. And I think that it's a perfect example of why it's important for people in the US to really study socialism and know what socialism is. Because with that education, like, if I were to bring Vosh to like Venezuela or Cuba and be like, hey, this is like the premier socialist, they'd be like, well, who the fuck is this guy? That's not socialism. That's Keynesian economics. That's neoliberal Democrat economics. And so it's just really sad to see that. But I'm glad that people like Jimmy Dore, like yourself, like others, were pushing for force to vote. And it's exactly what the left should be doing, what socialists should be doing. And I will say that I think that also the left really needs to learn new strategies. One of the biggest reasons why I think Jimmy Dore is on the cutting edge of, even though he may not necessarily define himself as a leftist or a socialist, but I think I really admire the work that he does, and I like the way he puts information out there, because he's not being politically correct. He's not being like these liberals who are so obsessed with language policing. You have to say the right things. Yeah. And it's just like, he's talking the way, if I walk out in the street right now, he's talking the way any person out in the street would be like, hey, where the hell is like Medicare for all? Like, I need to go get treatment. We should be talking like that populist language, the way, and that's the way Hugo Chavez spoke as well in Venezuela. He wasn't like, well, I believe that the Bolivarian, he was like, right. Yankees de mierda. He spoke the way an average working class person spoke. And we need to get back to that. And that's the reason why the right wing is winning the culture war in the US. Honestly, a lot of the quote unquote BreadTube is fucking boring, man. Like, it's boring. Like, they're just following DNC top way working right now, and I think the left really needs to understand that if they want to win people over, A, you have to hold elected officials accountable, but B, you can't be afraid to talk the way you talk just because of some Twitter mob storm,
Yeah, I'm glad that you made that comparison with Hugo Chavez and Jimmy Dore, also Maduro, because it's authentic and it's relatable, right? People are sick and tired of these career politicians that lie to us, and the strategy that these people on BreadTube take is they repeat what corporate media says about foreign policy because they're lazy, like they don't want to educate themselves, and that's what they prey upon with the audience members. Because that's how we've been brainwashed from birth. We've been brainwashed to think that America is the best, or like Caleb says, like West is the best, like what they tell us over and over again. They prey upon our illiteracy on foreign policy. And right now we are seeing the monster of capitalism in its highest form, which is imperialism. Right, we are going into other countries to steal resources for the greed of billionaires and multinationals. While there have been several countries that fell victim to Western and U.S. imperialism, several other countries like Cuba and China have fought back successfully to liberate themselves from the imperial powers. We're also seeing resistance to imperialism happening in Latin American countries like Bolivia and Venezuela. What can the American people learn from the history of these countries in order to successfully win against U.S. corporatism and imperialism?
People in the United States should definitely study what's going on in countries around the world and should definitely learn and not take this arrogant tone. Unfortunately, in the left, the US left, they have this ideological checklist of like, oh, well, do they have this? Do they have that? If they don't, I'm not going to support them. And I think people in the US left, the first world left, they need to get out of this utopian mindset. And this is going back to what we were talking about before, the difference between scientific socialism and utopian or anarchist socialism, where the utopianists, the idealists, they expect everything to be perfect, right? For everything to be exactly as how they envision it in their mind. But as scientific socialists, we understand that the material conditions determine the ideas. The changes in the economics and the structure of society will determine how revolutions are played out in the 21st century. And so it's not going to look exactly the same way it did in the Soviet Union. There's not going to be a Bolshevik uprising in the US. There's not going to be, the Fidel and Che in the United States. There's not going to be a Mao in the United States. It's going to take a totally different form in the United States because the conditions are different in every country. And that's another aspect of Marxism that I think gets forgotten about a lot, is that it's not a copy and paste formula for each country. There's a general formulaic structure to it, but you have to add in certain variables to each country. For example, in the case of, let's say, Nicaragua, where there was the Sandinista revolution in 1979, one of the leading institutions of that revolution was the Catholic Church. And for somebody who is so used to seeing, like, let's say, the Soviet and the Chinese revolutions, where the churches were totally like outlawed and abolished and didn't play a role, in Nicaragua it was the opposite. The Catholic churches were actually where a lot of the guerrillas were based and organized, and a lot of them were priests who believed in liberation theology. In Peru as well, Gustavo Gutierrez, who's one of the liberation theology founders in Peru, he also had a Catholic socialism. And so, I'm an atheist, I'm not religious, but as a scientific socialist, I'll work with people who are religious and are for socialism, even if it doesn't fit my understanding of what pure socialism is. The same thing with Iran. Iran is a Shia Muslim country. It has different values, but at the same time, they're still resisting U.S. empire. They're still resisting sanctions. They're trading with Venezuela. They're helping Nicaragua and Cuba trade, even amid sanctions. And so even though, like, when we think of anti-imperialist revolution, Iran doesn't necessarily come to mind, it's doing more than what people would think it is doing, because in the material world, in the real world, it's actually carrying out that. So I would say, in the United States, like, study what's going on in other countries and apply it to the local conditions. But also another thing that I have to say, and this is kind of where I disagree with some of the left in the first world in the US, is also that the United States is not any other country, right? We can't put a country like the United States on the same page as Venezuela, for example, right? Because in Venezuela, they uphold, like, for example, Simon Bolivar, right? They call the revolution the Bolivarian Revolution. And Bolivar was the liberator of a few countries. He came from a more Criollo background. He came from a more Spanish descent background. But nonetheless, he was the figure that Chavez and others used to propel their movement forward. I would say you can't take that same formula and apply it to the United States and be like, oh, this is the Washingtonian Revolution or the Lincolnite Revolution, because they had a totally different role. We're talking about the biggest empire in human history. The whole foundation of the United States is based on plunder, on imperialism, on settler colonialism. And so I think that before we can even talk about socialism and revolution in the United States, we have to address the fundamental question of reparations for Black and Indigenous people, for Chicano people, imperialism, reparations for people around the world. People think about all the countries that the U.S. has bombed: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. How are we going to talk about getting all these, more things for people in the United States when the U.S. just bombed the shit out of this other country, and they're like, yo, like, you just totally wrecked our country. What about us?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think that within a global, so we also have to move beyond the nation state model. In my opinion, I believe that the nation state model is becoming more obsolete. And we need to think about a global socialist revolution where these countries that exist now may not even exist in the future. If you look at a map 300-400 years ago, it may look totally different than it is today. And 300 or 400 years ago, in our mind, sounds like a long time ago, but in the span of human history, it's like a blink of an eye. And so we have to begin to detach ourselves from these false nation state borders and begin to understand ourselves as a global international working class, which is what Marxism is really about. And it's something that I think that people in the US in particular have to keep in mind is like, yes, we should, fight for socialism. We should, fight for better conditions for poor people in the US, 100%. But we can't forget the huge amount owed to people in the global South, to indigenous people, to African people, that this whole empire was based on. It's all based on the exploitation and looting of the country. So that has to be front and center, or else people around the world are going to be like, who the fuck wants to work with them,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what would be the best way for America to transition from what we have now to 21st century socialism with American characteristics?
I think, in my opinion, if we're talking about socialism on lands that belong to quote unquote the United States, it would have to incorporate a total redesigning of the country. I think that, going back to the analogy of the decaying house or the structured house, we would have to totally remodel it, because the very foundations of it, the 50 stars on that flag, let's say somebody who's Hawaiian, right? Someone who's from Hawaii, a nation that has its own history, its own people, its own language, customs, for them to just be a star in this imperialist flag is pretty offensive to them. Same thing with Puerto Rico as well, even though they're not a state, but like, they have their own nation, they're their own people. And Lenin talked about this as well in the Soviet Union, is the right of nations to self-determination, right? I think something along the lines of like what the Soviet Union had, again, not copying and pasting, but a socialist federation. Imagine if we could have a socialist union or federation of indigenous tribes, of African Black communities in the South, of Hawaiian communities, of Puerto Ricans, maybe even Appalachians, a socialist federation of all of these different nations working together. So, that's kind of where I'm somewhere in between, right? Because there's people who just say, let's just forget about all the colonization. We're America, we're Americans. This is the United States. Let's just build one socialist United States. Then there's the other people who are like, fuck everybody, complete sovereignty. Let's create our own little nations. I don't think either works. I think that we need a combination of the two, where we have like socialist federations, cooperation between Chicanos in the Southwest who have their land still, and indigenous people in New Mexico, the Navajo Nation, Hawaiians, African communities in Alabama, Mississippi, where they determine what they want to do. They have national self-determination, but they're also operating within a larger socialist federation of collaboration and cooperation. So I think that's really kind of the groundwork for what we can have.
So you know about third worldism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just found out about this recently. I was told by someone on my Discord that it's about fundraising for third world countries and movements because people don't see a revolution happening in the first world. So I just wanted to know what your position on that is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely consider myself a third worldist communist. However, around the world, if you say you're a third worldist in the United States, people are like, what? Like, you're ultra left, or you're revisionist, or you're this and that. But around the world, that's just regular socialism and communism and Marxism, Leninism. Because going back to the history of revolution, right? We have the two trends in the time of the Soviet Union that dominated. There was Trotsky and Trotskyism, and there was Lenin and Stalin, and they followed Leninism, or what we call socialism in one country. And Trotsky believed that the European nations, Western Europe, would lead socialism. He believed that because Germany, England, France had already reached a farther point into capitalism, because of that, they would be closer to socialism. And so we should focus our energies on Western Europe, the United States. And it was a more Eurocentric socialist understanding, right? Lenin and Stalin believed in socialism in one country. They were also called the Zimmerwaldists after a conference where they fought for this idea that the Eastern countries, Russia, Mongolia, China, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Central Asia, China, these would be the leading sources of revolution because the material conditions are worse. And it turned out to be just that in the 21st century. Where did we see the main revolutions carry out? It wasn't in France. It wasn't in the UK. It wasn't in the United States. It was in Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, Africa, Latin America, literally within a period of 20, 30, 40 years, which is nothing in human history, extremely fast. And so what we've seen objectively in human history is that revolutions happen in the places where people are most exploited under capitalism. And capitalism does create that. And even Lenin and third worldism is it's not something that is totally new or fake. This is something that people have been writing about since Lenin. Lenin wrote about, read Engels writing on the condition of the British working class in 1844, I believe. He was already talking about how even though people were oppressed under capitalism in the UK, because they were in the core, what we call the imperial core, where the commodities are go to, they had more alienation. They believed they were part of that empire. Like here in the US, for example, there's a saying that there's no revolutions in the US because every poor person thinks they're a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. And that's so true because people have this illusion that, okay, like I might have poverty now, but if I work hard enough, the American dream, I can become rich, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that's to say that there's more access to wealth because they're in the imperial core of the empire. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like the clothes that we're wearing, the food that we eat, the clothes that I'm wearing comes from, sweatshop maquilas in Latin America. The food I eat, the coffee I drink probably comes from Peru. Like that all is extracted from the global South. And Lenin wrote about it, Engels wrote about it, Mao wrote about it. Kim Il-sung also wrote about it as well. And that's why he promoted the idea of Asian, African, and Latin American solidarity against US imperialism. Lin Biao in China also wrote about third worldism. Che Guevara, interestingly enough, a lot of people really fail to ignore this, but Che Guevara, he in a few interviews, he mentioned that, he's like, someone asked him about labor struggles in the US and a victory. And he was like, congratulations to the US working class, but don't forget that those victories and wealth are based on the exploitation of people in the global South. And I believe Che Guevara was definitely towards the end of his life moving toward a third worldist position. And I think that what we've seen in history objectively is that revolutions take place in the most exploited countries, as Marx himself said in the Communist Manifesto, the wretched of the earth. Who are the wretched of the earth? The people who live in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where people have the least resources because they're less able to be brought off by the empire. And that's why we see in the US, because the resources are extracted from the global South here, they're able to prop up tokens like AOC, like Ilhan Omar, and use them to be like, look, anybody can make it here. Because we give them a little piece of the pie that we steal from all over the world. And so, that's why I do consider myself a third worldist. I don't consider third worldism to be ultra left or a deviation from Marxism, Leninism. I consider it to be the logical continuation of Marxism, Leninism.
Yeah, the U.S. definitely props up the exceptions, like Oprah Winfrey too. Like we see it in the entertainment industry too. I have some friends who are in the chat right now who think in terms of, oh, because this country has like some elements of capitalism and it's not really socialist, or they say, oh, because this country has some elements of socialism and it's not capitalist. So what is the problem with thinking in terms of pure socialism or pure anything? How the existence of contradictions doesn't make something not socialist?
Yeah, that's another great point and question that I think people in the first world left have to really study and examine. The Marxist way of understanding anything in society is different from the way that liberals and conservatives view. So in philosophy, we have what's called epistemology, right? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, the study of reality, of how we look at things and examine it, right? And so in Western epistemology, in Aristotle and John Locke and all these other people, they say, A is not equal to B. Like A is A and B is B, right? They're two separate things, and they're two different things that are not related. Now, a Marxist and dialectical way of understanding it is that A and B are connected and they are interconnected as one thing and they have features of each other that are connected. So, just to give an example, right? Um, let's look at a shoreline of a beach, right? If we look at a map of a beach and we see like it shows exactly where the water and the land meet, right? And so there's a demarcation. That map is technically not 100% accurate because there are certain moments where the tide is lower and the tide is higher, and so that water will be in more sometimes, and the border will change, and it's more outward, and it'll change as well. And that's because the water and the sand are in a dialectical relationship with one another. Even though they're two different things, water and sand, they're interconnected because they form this one totality or a boundary. And so that's something that people have to really understand is a dialectical way of understanding things, is that everything in the things don't just exist in themselves. Everything is a process in motion that comprises of two interconnected parts, a thesis and antithesis, right? And so these two components form one totality. The same way you can't have hot without cold, you can't have day without night, you can't have electrons without protons. Everything in nature has its opposite. And this is what, even going back to like the whole concept of yin yang and duality, what other societies have understood. And so with this in mind, we can't say that this is capitalism and this is socialism, because again, it's a continuum. Capitalism flows into socialism the same way that night, it's not like, for example, here I'm in LA right now, right? And it's 3:30. The sun is beginning to slowly go down, right? And so you can't say it's exactly day or it's exactly night, because it's somewhere in between. It's a spectrum because it oscillates between one and the other. And that's part of the dialectical way of understanding reality, is that, okay, if socialism is one pole and capitalism is one pole, it's not a light switch, right?
Yeah.
It's not from one day to the other. Okay, we're officially socialists. Congrats. It doesn't work that way. History does not work that way. The same way feudalism, there wasn't a day when people announced, "Hey, everybody, we're no longer in feudalism. We're officially in capitalism. Congratulations." It doesn't work like that. There's a process, a spectrum by which it transforms. And that's the dialectical way of understanding reality. And so that's how people need to understand the construction of socialism, is that it takes time. It's a process. The same way that, you're going to get into, you're going to you're going to boil some water, right? You're going to make some tea or some coffee. You can't just immediately turn the water hot. You got to turn the flame up, turn it a little more until eventually it reaches a quantitative point where the quality changes and it becomes a new system. And that's the way we have to understand reality, where, it's not just one or the other. That's a bourgeois way of thinking, right? Where it's like A is A and B is B. It's like, no, A can become B because they're interconnected, and it's a process that links the two.
Yeah, I think the simplest way to put it is that everything is not black and white. You know,
Right.
everything is a process, and then we see things in certain timestamps, right? Like what you said, like it's not like it doesn't just go from like day to night immediately like that,
Right.
like a light switch. Even with a light switch, if you like break it down in milliseconds, the light is dimmed down, right? But we see it happen so fast that it appears to be just like light on or light off. It's just
Exactly.
that's just how the universe is, and people need to understand that you don't just wake up one day and all of a sudden you go from you're a child, you go to sleep, and you wake up you're a man. No, you go through puberty,
Right.
right? That's what people need to understand. I really enjoyed this conversation, Ramiro. I would
Oh,
love to have you back on.
yeah, most
Uh,
definitely, bro. Anytime.
yeah, so you want to give a final shout out, like where people can find you and your work?
Yeah, most definitely. So you could follow me on Twitter and Facebook at Ramiro Comunista. You could also follow Anticonquista, which is the project I'm involved with. I'm one of the co-editors of Anticonquista. You could follow us there at Anticonquista. YouTube, all that. I'm not on Instagram. I got off of Instagram because I started getting too distracted. I saw the social dilemma on Netflix, and I was like, fuck, I need to get off of Instagram. But yeah, follow me anywhere, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And shout out to everybody who follows and watches Anticonquista. Shout out to your channel. And anytime you want to collab, man, I'm always down.
Yeah, man, I'm a fan, and you have some fans in the chat right now who will
Cool.
drop down the link to your channel. And everybody else, thank you guys so much for watching. I love you all, and don't forget to stay informed.